Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sony FE40mm f2.5G, a compact, lightweight prime lens that's designed for their full-frame mirrorless cameras. Announced in March 2021 and costing $599, it delivers slightly wider than so-called standard coverage that in practice strikes a surprisingly compelling balance between traditional 35 and 50mm lenses. Meanwhile, the f2.5 aperture may not be as fast as some other models, but on full-frame bodies can still provide a fair degree of blurring in the background, while more importantly allowing a very compact design to be achieved. This makes it one of the most attractive, general-purpose walk-around lenses from Sony to date, and in this review I'll show you how it performs in practice. The 40-2.5 was launched alongside 24-2.8 and 50mm 2.5 models as part of a compact triplet. All three share the same external design and dimensions, not to mention the same $599 price, and I've made reviews of all three. Which is your favourite? The concept of a compact prime lens is not a new one. Sony originally launched its full-frame mirrorless system with a 55-1.8 and 35-2.8, which both showed off the potential for compact combinations. But apart from a later 28 f2, Sony seemed to move away from this initial strategy and has instead focused on very high performance and inevitably larger lenses. While I love the quality of the G Master series, I always lamented the lack of any new compact models from Sony for times when portability or discretion are more important. Third parties saw the opportunity and ran with it, most notably Sigma, which now has 4 compact primes available in the E-mount as part of its contemporary I series. Here's the Sigma 24, 35 and 45 models, with a 65 completing the set, and coincidentally the first 3 all cost roughly the same as the new Sonys. In this review, you'll see how the new Sony FE40mm 2.5G directly compares against the Sigma 45 2.8 DGDN. Both are attractive options for anyone who wants a walk-around lens that's a bit different from a standard 50. Before anything else, let's look at coverage, starting with the Sony 35mm on a full-frame body. Next, here's the Sony 40 with its slightly tighter field of view, followed by the Sigma 45 being a little tighter still. And finally the Sony 50 with so-called standard coverage. Side by side there doesn't appear to be that much difference between them, but each does actually feel quite different in use. Note that if you mount the 40 on an APS-C body, it becomes equivalent to 60mm or a very short telephoto. At 68 by 45mm and weighing 173 grams, the Sony 40-2.5 can't be described as a pancake lens, but it remains very compact nonetheless. Alongside, Sigma's 45 2.8 is fractionally narrower and longer and a little heavier at 215 grams, but you wouldn't choose one over the other on size or weight as they're essentially the same once mounted. They do have quite different controls though. The Sony 40 2.5 has a tactile but very narrow aperture ring with a smooth focusing ring right alongside it. It's quite tight. Impressively, Sony's managed to squeeze in a small customizable focus hold button, as well as the chance to declick the aperture ring with a switch, features that are both missing from the Sigma. The filter thread on the Sony measures 49mm. Meanwhile, the Sigma 45 2.8 positions its aperture ring further back with wider knurling on either side of the F numbers. There's a bit more breathing space for it on the barrel. The manual focusing ring is similarly damped to the Sony lens, but again the Sigma lacks the focus hold button and declickable options. It's less featured, but less cluttered too. The Sigma takes larger 55mm filters. Both lenses are described as being dust and splash proof with subtle rubber grommets at their mounts, although thorough resistance may not extend to their entire barrels, so do bear that in mind. Both lenses are supplied with very different hoods. Sony's opted for a design that slopes inwards and can be used with a cap without reaching inside, while Sigma's is a more traditional cylinder that's clearly much more substantial. Both proved effective, but while Sony's occupies much less space, I actually preferred the look of the Sigma. Okay, now for a focusing comparison, starting with the Sony 40-2.5 on an Alpha 1 body and using single AFS to focus between the bottles, where the performance is swift, silent and confident. Switching to the Sigma 45 2.8, again on the Alpha 1 at the maximum aperture, and you'll notice it's still pretty quick, but there's a tiny wobble at each end of the focus pull to confirm. I've noticed this with Sigma lenses on Sony bodies before, and it goes away if you have them set to continuous AFC mode, but in single AF mode there's a minor contrast hunt. Nothing to be concerned about though. Next, for a test with the Sony 40 2.5 on the Alpha 1 with wide area and continuous AFC. With human eye detection enabled, the camera drives the lens very confidently. Now I don't have a direct comparison with the Sigma lens here, so I'll show you a more useful side-by-side portrait test to make up for it. Let's start with the Sony 2.5 with its aperture wide open. 40 is more on the environmental side of portraiture, capturing more of your surroundings, but it's still long enough to avoid distortion if you're careful, and also able to deliver some blurring in the background when open to f2.5. Taking a closer look at the Sony portrait shows pin-sharp details on my eyeball as driven by the Alpha 1's eye detection, and across multiple portrait tests, every single eye was equally sharp. Moving sideways for a closer look at the rendering shows a reasonable degree of subject separation, and while the effect can be attractive, there are fairly defined edges to some of the blurred elements. Okay, back to the full view of the portrait taken with the Sony 40, before switching to the Sigma 45 2.8 from the same distance, which understandably means a slightly tighter field of view. Now, in my test on the Alpha 1, I experienced a lower hit rate using eye detection on the Sigma than with the Sony lenses. Now, I still got plenty of focused images, but not the 100% hit rate that I did with the Sony lens. With both portraits side by side, you'll notice my eyeball on the Sony on the left is visibly crisper than the Sigma on the right. Now, it's not that the Sigma is bad or poorly focused here, and viewed in isolation, you'd be very happy with it. It's just that the Sony 40 in a direct comparison is sharper. That sharpness is, however, a double-edged sword, as when you compare the background blurred areas, the Sigma is noticeably smoother with less defined edges and a less busy-looking result overall. Of course, the Sigma also has the benefit of a slightly longer focal length here, but you're mostly seeing different rendering styles. The look of bokeh is a very personal thing though, and some prefer one style over the other. So, which lens did you prefer for this portrait test? Okay, now for the rendering of bokeh balls from close range, starting with the Sony 2.5 near to its closest focusing distance and working between the maximum aperture of f2.5 up to f8. From this distance, it's certainly possible to generate some reasonable bokeh balls, but unsurprisingly for a lens of this size and price, there's visible outlining around their edges and concentric onion ringing patterns within. With the lens close to f4 or smaller, the 7-bladed diaphragm system also becomes visible with blobs taking on a 7-sided shape. Here's the Sony 2.5 on the left and the Sigma 45 2.8 on the right, both at their maximum apertures and from the same distance. With a slightly longer focal length, it's no surprise to find the Sigma delivering a slightly tighter view with slightly bigger bokeh balls, but otherwise their rendering style is actually pretty similar. The Sigma on the right may exhibit a little less outlining on its blobs, but both contain textures and share similar shapes as you close their apertures down. In terms of minimum focusing distances, Sony quotes 28 cm when using autofocus or 25 with manual, which is pretty much the same as the Sigma lens. And here's what I could achieve with the Sony when manually focusing it. It's reproduced a subject size of 14 cm across the frame, and even with the aperture wide open, the details are pretty sharp right up to the edges. Now here's the Sony 40 at the top and the Sigma 45 at the bottom, both from their closest manually focused distances and using their maximum apertures. The Sigma at the bottom is delivering slightly greater magnification, reproducing 13 cm across the frame, but with their apertures wide open, the Sigma becomes much softer at the edges from this distance. At the other end of the scale, here's my distant landscape scene, starting with the Sony 2.5 on the Alpha 1 at f2.5, and with the view angled so that details run right into the corners. Zooming in on the middle section shows there's no problems in terms of resolving fine detail at the maximum aperture and with a 50 megapixel body too, and no need to close it down to improve the quality here. Moving out to the far corner also shows the lens is capable of maintaining sharpness across the frame even at the maximum aperture, and there's only very mild vignetting or darkening in the corners to mention. In terms of sharpness, it is way better in the corners than the budget 51.8. As I close the aperture, the vignetting quickly disappears, but it's clear there's no significant benefit to sharpness, which looks great out of the gate. Checking the raw files does show that the JPEGs are benefiting from some correction to geometry and also vignetting when using the default Alpha 1 settings, but that's normal for this kind of lens. With the Sony 2.5 on the left and the Sigma 45 2.8 on the right, both showing magnified views of their central areas, you'll see both perform very well at their respective maximum apertures, although obviously the Sigma's view is a little more magnified due to its slightly longer focal length. Switching to their corners, and again that difference in focal length means we're looking at different details but from the same part of the frame. I'd say the Sony 40 has an edge in the very extreme corners, but you don't need to move in very much before they're effectively neck and neck. So a very minor win for the Sony here, but both lenses are doing well with distant subjects even with their apertures wide open and draw pretty much alongside when stopped down a little. Right, now let's check out the autofocus for movies, first with simple pulls from one bottle to the other using a single AF area. Here the Sony 42.5 is smooth, quiet and confident as I recompose. Now for a comparison, here's the Sigma 45 2.8, and it too is refocusing smoothly and quietly, and now that it's set to AFC mode in video, the distracting hunting seen on the earlier AFS test has effectively gone. So I'd call it a draw here. Next, a video test for face and eye detection, starting with the Sony 42.5 again at 2.5, where the Alpha 1 easily tracks me around the frame. 40mm is also a nice focal length for filming pieces to camera when you want to capture more of the surroundings without getting too wide. And now compared to the Sigma 45 2.8 at 2.8, where it also works pretty seamlessly for face and eye tracking. Maybe there's a hint to the Sigma being a fraction less responsive than the Sony lens here, but it really is fractional. And finally, a focus breathing test starting with the Sony 42.5 manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again at f22. Now, as you focus the lens closer, the field of view reduces quite noticeably, an artifact that I've seen on a number of Sony lenses. It's something that bothers some videographers, or indeed focus stackers, but it won't be an issue for most stills photography. And for comparison, here's the Sigma 45 2.8 manually focusing between infinity and the closest distance, again at f22, but this time the amount of breathing is much lower than the Sony. Depending on your usage, this may make the Sigma more attractive. Okay, now it's time for my final verdict, and as I wrap up my review of the lens, I'll show you a selection of images I shot with it on the Alpha 1. As always, you can access the original images for closer inspection via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com. The Sony FE 40mm f2.5G is a simple but highly compelling lens. I've rarely shot at this focal length before, but found it immediately appealing and surprisingly refreshing, ideal for anyone who finds 50mm a bit too long for general use, but feels 35 is either too wide or not wide enough. In contrast, the 40mm coverage feels very natural, and of the three new Sony prime lenses launched together, it's by far my favourite. Like the new 24 and 50 models, the 40 delivers respectably crisp results across the frame even wide open, much better than the budget 51.8. The aperture is sufficiently large for mild blurring effects, and the focusing is quick and quiet. What makes all three lenses really special though is their size, which transforms any alpha mirrorless body into a very compact, portable camera system. Indeed, I've often felt Sony had forgotten the charm and appeal of small lenses, instead preferring to chase the glory of high performance and large aperture titans, so I'm delighted it's made not one but three new lenses for people who desire a more compact, discreet or portable option. Unsurprisingly, as a mid-priced compact lens, the 42.5 isn't perfect. Like most lenses at this level, the rendering of blurred areas is a little busy, with more defined outlining and onion ring patterns that are generally absent on the bokeh blobs of higher-end models. There's also quite notable focus breathing, although to be fair, this generally only annoys some videographers, and interestingly, it's an artifact that Sony seems willing to overlook even on its best lenses. There's also the fact that while Sony's been neglecting smaller lenses, companies like Sigma have spotted the opportunity and already produced 4 in the E-mount. Sigma's 45 2.8 DGDN is closest to the Sony 42.5, and both models are similarly priced and similarly sized, as well as delivering similar results too in many of my tests. The Sony edged ahead on sharpness in my portrait and macro tests, but the Sigma exhibited less focus breathing and sometimes more attractive rendering. I personally feel the inclusion of a focus hold button and the ability to declick the aperture ring gives the Sony the edge overall, but I'd recommend comparing both models very closely. To paraphrase the old saying, you wait all day for Sony to release a new compact lens and then 3 come along at once. I'm delighted Sony is finally catering once more to those who value portability, and the 3 new FE Primes are fun additions to any kit. Of the 3, my favourite once again is the 42.5, delivering coverage that feels both natural and yet refreshingly unique. It's the perfect walk-around lens, and every Sony owner should consider it. More small lenses, please. Right, that's it for this review. As always, if you found any of it useful, you can reward me with a like and a follow. It only takes a moment to click, but really helps me out, so thanks for that. If you're feeling extra generous, you could treat me to a coffee or treat yourself to my in-camera photography book or perhaps some Camera Labs merchandise, and there's links to everything including the latest prices on the lens below. Oh, and if you're interested in the Sony 24 2.8 or 50 2.5 models, I also have reviews of those. Let me know which is your favourite model, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.